Alright everyone, let's go ahead and get started. First off, I want to congratulate you on taking this journey. The CISSP is no joke, it's a challenging, high-stakes marathon, but it is absolutely achievable if you approach it the right way. And the right way starts right here, with Domain 1, Security and Risk Management. Now, I want to be very clear about something from the outset. A lot of people come into this field thinking that security is purely technical: firewalls, intrusion detection systems, penetration testing. And yes, those things matter. But when you sit for the CISSP, you need to shift your mindset. You are no longer just a technician. You are an architect. You are building the framework that allows an organization to operate securely, to make smart decisions, and to recover when things inevitably go wrong. Domain 1 is the foundation for everything else. If you don't understand risk management, governance, and the business context of security, the rest of the domains will feel like you're building a house on sand. My tip for you today: when you're reading exam questions, ask yourself, what would a manager do? A common pitfall is choosing the most technical or expensive solution just because it sounds impressive. Avoid that. The CISSP wants to see that you understand the business mission first. So we're going to spend quality time here, and I'm going to give you the context, the examples, and the insider tips that will help you not only pass the exam but actually become a leader in this field. Let me give you a mental model that has served me well throughout my career, and it is absolutely essential for the exam. Think of any organization as a line. At the very left end, what I call the alpha, you have risk management. At the very right end, the omega, you have business continuity. And everything else in security sits somewhere in between. Here's why this matters. Every single security decision you will ever make, every control you implement, every policy you write, it all starts with risk. You cannot protect what you have not assessed. That's not just a catchy phrase, it's the truth. If you don't know what assets you have, what they're worth, what threats exist, and what vulnerabilities are present, then you are essentially flying blind. Risk management is where we answer the question, what are we actually trying to protect, and how much effort should we spend protecting it? Now, let's talk about the other end. The omega. Business continuity. This is the ultimate purpose of all our security work. Every action we take ultimately supports one goal: keeping the organization moving forward. Security is not an end in itself. I need you to repeat that to yourself. Security is not an end in itself. It is the structural support that keeps the business running. If you ever implement a control that stops the business from functioning, you have failed. Let me give you a concrete example. I once worked with a company that decided to implement a new access control system that required 3 different forms of authentication for every single internal email login. It was incredibly secure. It was also a disaster. Employees were spending 15 minutes just to log into their email. Productivity plummeted. Customer service suffered. And within 2 weeks, people were finding workarounds, sharing credentials, and writing passwords on sticky notes. The security measure actually created more risk because it was so disruptive. Here's a sample question you might see on the exam. A new regulation requires customer data to be encrypted. The CISO implements a complex algorithm that slows database queries by 50%. Is this a good security decision? The answer is no. Because while it addresses confidentiality, it destroys availability. If the business can't access its data to serve customers, the organization cannot function. Security must enable the business, not hinder it. A key tip for you: when you're reading exam questions, always look for the business context. The exam will try to distract you with technical details, but the correct answer is almost always the one that balances security with business operations. And here's a pitfall to avoid: never assume that more security is always better. The CISSP exam tests your ability to find the right balance, not the maximum security posture. Remember, risk management is about informed decision-making, not fear-based overprotection. Now we're going to talk about what I call the heartbeat of information security. You might know it as the CIA Triad, but I prefer to use AIC to keep it distinct from the intelligence agency. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. These three principles will appear in more exam questions than almost any other topic, so we need to get this absolutely right. Let's break each one down in detail. Confidentiality is all about ensuring that data is only accessible to authorized individuals. This is the principle of keeping secret secret. In technical terms, we achieve confidentiality through encryption, access controls, data classification, and the principle of least privilege. But here's the nuance: confidentiality isn't just about technology. It's also about process. Who has access to what? Do we have a clean desk policy? Are we shredding sensitive documents? Confidentiality fails when someone looks at something they shouldn't, whether that's through a hack, a misconfigured permission, or simply leaving a printed report on a desk. Integrity is about ensuring that data is accurate, complete, and has not been tampered with. This is critical in areas like financial transactions, medical records, and legal documents. If someone changes a digit in a bank account, that's an integrity violation. We maintain integrity through hashing, digital signatures, version control, and strict change management processes. Integrity also includes non-repudiation, the ability to prove that a specific action was performed by a specific individual and that it hasn't been altered since. Availability is about ensuring that data and systems are accessible when authorized users need them. This is the principle that often gets overlooked by technical purists but is absolutely essential in the real world. If a server goes down and customers can't make purchases, you have an availability problem. We ensure availability through redundancy, failover systems, disaster recovery planning, and robust infrastructure design. Availability is also the principle that attackers target when they launch distributed denial of service attacks. They're not trying to steal data or change it, they're simply trying to make it inaccessible. Now here's where the exam gets tricky. These three principles often conflict with each other, and you need to know how to prioritize based on context. In a hospital emergency room, what's the most important principle? Availability. If a doctor can't access a patient's allergy list during surgery because of a lockout policy, someone could die. The hospital will accept slightly lower confidentiality or integrity controls to ensure that information is available when needed. Now consider a defense contractor working on classified weapons systems. What's the priority? Confidentiality. If that information leaks, national security is compromised. Even if availability suffers occasionally, confidentiality must be absolute. Now think about a financial auditor reviewing transaction logs. What matters most? Integrity. If there's any doubt about whether the records have been tampered with, the entire audit is worthless. The auditor needs absolute assurance that the data is unchanged. Let me give you a sample question. A web server is hit by a massive distributed denial of service attack, and customers cannot access their accounts. Which core principle is being violated? Availability. The data is still confidential and it still has integrity, but nobody can get to it. Another one. An employee accidentally modifies a configuration file, causing the system to display incorrect pricing information to customers. Which principle is violated? Integrity. The data has been changed without proper authorization. A common pitfall I see is people mixing up integrity with availability. Remember, if the data is wrong, that's integrity. If the data is inaccessible, that's availability. Keep those clear in your mind. My tip for you, when you're studying, practice identifying which principle is at stake in every scenario you read. It becomes second nature. And it will serve you well on exam day. Let's move on to how we actually manage who gets access to what. In the security world, we use a framework called IAAA. That stands for Identification, Authentication, Authorization, and Accountability. I want you to think of this as a pipeline. Each step happens in order, and if any step fails, access is denied. Let's walk through each one carefully. Identification is the first step. This is simply the user claiming an identity. It's the username. It's the employee ID number. It's the email address. Identification is the who do you claim to be step. And here's an important nuance: identification alone is not secure. Anyone can claim to be anyone. That's why we need the next step. Authentication is the proof. This is where the user provides evidence that they are who they claim to be. We typically categorize authentication factors into three types: something you know, like a password or PIN; something you have, like a smart card, token, or mobile device; and something you are, like a fingerprint, retina scan, or voice pattern. The strongest authentication uses at least two of these factors. That's what we call multi-factor authentication. Authentication answers the question, prove it. Authorization comes next. Once we've identified the user and authenticated them, we need to determine what they're allowed to do. Authorization is the permission step. It's the access control list. It's the role-based permissions. It answers the question, what are you allowed to access and what actions are you allowed to perform? A common mistake is confusing authentication with authorization. Just because you proved who you are doesn't mean you have permission to do everything. Accountability is the final piece. This is the audit trail. Accountability ensures that we can trace actions back to individual users. If someone deletes a critical file, accountability tells us who did it, when they did it, and what they did. This is achieved through logging, audit trails, and non-repudiation mechanisms like digital signatures. Accountability is what makes the other three meaningful, because without it, there's no consequence for misuse. Let me give you a real-world scenario to tie this together. Imagine you walk into a secure office building. At the front desk, you give your name. That's identification. You then swipe your employee badge and place your finger on a biometric scanner. That's authentication, something you have and something you are. Once you're authenticated, the system checks your permissions to see which floors you're allowed to access. That's authorization. And every time you swipe through a door, the system logs your entry. That's accountability. Now here's a classic exam question that trips people up. A user logs into a system using their username and password. They successfully log in, but when they try to open a specific file, they receive an access denied message. What has failed? Many people will say authentication failed. But that's incorrect. The user successfully authenticated because they got past the login screen. The failure is authorization. They proved who they were, but they don't have permission to access that file. Here's another one. An organization implements a policy requiring all users to change their passwords every 30 days. What aspect of IAAA is this strengthening? Authentication. Because the password is an authentication factor, and requiring regular changes reduces the risk of compromised credentials being used indefinitely. A key tip for you: when you see exam questions about access control, mentally walk through the pipeline. First, identify. Second, authenticate. Third, authorize. Fourth, hold accountable. Determine at which step the scenario is focused. And here's a pitfall: don't assume that a biometric system is authorization. Biometrics are authentication, they prove identity. Authorization is about permissions, not proof of identity. Now let's talk about one of the most critical concepts for both the exam and your career. This is about understanding who does what when it comes to security governance. There's a fundamental division of labor between senior management and the security team. And if you confuse these roles, you will get questions wrong. Let me make this crystal clear. Senior management, the board of directors, the CEO, the executive leadership, they own the security program. They are responsible for setting the organization's risk tolerance. They decide how much risk the organization is willing to accept in pursuit of its objectives. They approve the budget for security initiatives. And here's the key: they are ultimately liable. When a breach happens, it's not the security analyst who gets sued, it's the CEO and the board. They own the risk. Now, the security practitioners, the CISO, the security managers, the analysts, the engineers, they are responsible for implementing the security program. They advise senior management on risks and recommend controls. They execute the strategy. They configure the firewalls, write the policies, and respond to incidents. They manage the security function. But they do not own the risk. They manage it on behalf of senior management. This distinction is absolutely critical. Let me give you an example. Suppose an organization decides not to implement encryption on a particular database because the performance impact is too high. The CISO presents the risks to the CEO, explaining the potential impact of a data breach. The CEO, after reviewing the business impact, decides that the performance cost outweighs the risk and chooses not to encrypt. 6 months later, a breach occurs, and customer data is exposed. Who is ultimately responsible? The CEO. The CISO did their job by advising and making recommendations. Senior management made the decision and accepted the risk. They own the liability. Now here's an exam question you might see. Who is ultimately responsible for ensuring that an organization's security policies align with business objectives? Many people will say the CISO. But the correct answer is senior management. The CISO advises and implements, but alignment with business objectives is a strategic decision that rests with leadership. Another question. A security policy is consistently violated by employees, and the CISO wants to implement stricter technical controls. However, the budget request is denied by the board. What should the CISO do? The CISO should document the risk, present it clearly to the board, and accept their decision. The CISO cannot override the board. They manage risk within the boundaries set by leadership. A tip for you: when you see questions about responsibility and accountability, look for who has the authority to make final decisions. That's usually senior management. And here's a pitfall: don't assume that the CISO is always the answer for leadership questions. The exam wants you to understand that security is a business function, and business leaders own business decisions. Security professionals don't operate in a vacuum. We have to navigate an increasingly complex landscape of laws, regulations, and standards that come from outside the organization. This is what we call compliance, and it's a huge part of Domain 1. You don't need to memorize every detail of every regulation, but you absolutely need to know the major frameworks and what they govern. Let me walk you through the key ones. First, GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. This is the European Union's privacy law, and it's one of the most comprehensive data protection frameworks in the world. Here's what you need to know: if your organization handles data of EU citizens, GDPR applies. It doesn't matter where your servers are located. It follows the data subject, not the data center. GDPR is all about privacy, consent, and the rights of individuals to control their personal data. It requires organizations to have a lawful basis for processing data, to provide transparency about how data is used, and to report breaches within 72 hours. The penalties are massive, up to 4% of global annual revenue. Next, HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. This is U.S. legislation that governs protected health information. If you work in healthcare, or if your organization handles medical records, HIPAA applies. It focuses on the privacy and security of patient information. It requires administrative, physical, and technical safeguards. And it has specific rules about who can access medical records and under what circumstances. Then we have PCI-DSS, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. This is not a law, but it might as well be, because if you accept credit card payments, you have to comply. The card brands, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, require compliance. PCI-DSS focuses on protecting cardholder data. It has 12 core requirements covering everything from firewall configurations to encryption to access controls. Finally, SOX, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. This came out of the Enron and WorldCom scandals. It applies to publicly traded companies in the U.S. and focuses on financial reporting. SOX is about integrity. It requires organizations to maintain accurate financial records and to have internal controls that prevent or detect fraud. For security professionals, this means ensuring that financial systems have strong access controls, audit trails, and change management processes. Now here's a critical nuance that the exam loves to test. Compliance is not the same as security. Being compliant with a regulation does not mean you are secure. Compliance is the floor. It's the minimum standard that you must meet to avoid legal penalties. Security is about managing risk, which often requires going beyond compliance requirements. I've seen organizations that were fully PCI compliant get breached because they did exactly what the standard said but didn't think about the broader risk picture. Here's a sample question. A company based in France has a web server located in the United States. The server stores customer addresses and purchase history for EU citizens. Which regulation primarily dictates the data privacy requirements? The answer is GDPR. Even though the server is in the US, the data belongs to EU citizens, so GDPR applies. Another question. A publicly traded company experiences a financial reporting error because someone altered transaction records without proper authorization. Which regulation would be most relevant? SOX, because it governs the integrity of financial reporting. A tip for you, when you see a question about regulations, first identify what type of data is involved. Medical data points to HIPAA. Payment card data points to PCI-DSS. EU citizen data points to GDPR. Financial reporting for public companies points to SOX. And here's a pitfall, don't assume that a regulation applies just because an organization is based in a certain country. Data jurisdiction is often about where the data subjects are located, not where the company headquarters sits. Now let's talk about how we organize the rules that govern security within an organization. There's a hierarchy here, and understanding it is essential for both the exam and for actually building a functional security program. If you get this wrong, you end up with policies that contradict procedures, standards that are too vague to implement, and a whole lot of confusion. At the top of the hierarchy, we have policies. Policies are high-level, broad statements of intent that come from senior management. They answer the question of why we're doing something. A policy might say, we will protect customer data or we will maintain a secure working environment. Policies are mandatory, but they don't tell you how to do anything. They set the direction and establish expectations. They should be written in plain language that anyone in the organization can understand. Below policies, we have standards. Standards are the what. They translate the broad policy into specific, mandatory requirements. A standard might say, all customer data must be encrypted using AES 256 or all passwords must be at least 12 characters long. Standards are technical and precise. They leave no room for interpretation. If a policy says we protect data, the standard says exactly how we protect it. Below standards, we have guidelines. Guidelines are recommended practices. They provide flexibility. A guideline might say, it is recommended that users choose passphrase rather than simple passwords or consider using multi-factor authentication for administrative accounts. Guidelines are not mandatory, but they represent best practices. They help people make good decisions when there's no specific standard that applies. At the bottom of the hierarchy, we have procedures. Procedures are step-by-step instructions. They answer the question of how to do something. A procedure might say, Step 1, open the encryption tool. Step 2, select the file. Step 3, choose AES 256 from the drop-down menu. Step 4, enter the encryption key. Procedures are detailed, specific, and mandatory when performing the task they describe. Now, here's why this hierarchy matters. Every lower-level document must align with the higher-level documents. A procedure cannot contradict a standard. A standard must support the policy. If you have a policy that says we protect data, but your standard allows unencrypted transmission, you have a problem. The hierarchy ensures consistency and clarity. Let me give you an example of how this works in practice. A company has a policy that says, all remote access must be secure. That's the why. The standard then says, all remote connections must use VPN with AES-256 encryption and multi-factor authentication. That's the what. The guideline might say, it is recommended that users connect from managed devices whenever possible. That's a best practice. And the procedure would be the step-by-step instructions for installing and configuring the VPN client. That's the how. Now here's an exam question. A document states, all administrative accounts must be reviewed quarterly and any accounts that have not been used in 90 days must be disabled. What type of document is this? This is a standard. It is mandatory and specific, but it is not a step-by-step procedure. It tells you what to do, not how to do it. Another question. A document provides instructions on how to request, approve, and provision a new user account, including screenshots and specific fields to fill out. This is a procedure. It's detailed, step-by-step, and task-oriented. A tip for you, when you see questions about documentation, look at the level of detail. Broad statements of intent are policies. Specific mandatory requirements are standards. Best practices and recommendations are guidelines. Detailed instructions are procedures. And here's a pitfall, don't confuse a standard with a procedure. A standard tells you what must be done. A procedure tells you exactly how to do it. Both are important, but they serve different purposes. Let's talk about something that keeps security professionals awake at night. Disasters. They are inevitable. I don't say that to scare you, but to prepare you. Whether it's a hurricane that floods your data center, a fire that destroys your primary office, a ransomware attack that encrypts your critical systems, or a power outage that takes down your servers, something will happen. The question is not if, but when. And your job is to ensure that when disaster strikes, the organization can survive. This is what we call BCDR, Business Continuity and Disaster Recovery. And I want to make a very important distinction because these terms are often used interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. Understanding the difference is critical for the exam and for real-world planning. Disaster recovery, or DR, is the technical side. It's about restoring IT systems and data after a disruption. How do we get the servers back online? How do we restore data from backups? How do we rebuild the network? Disaster recovery is focused on the technology. It answers the question, how do we get our technical infrastructure back to a working state? Business continuity, or BC, is the business side. It's about keeping the organization functioning during and after a disruption. While the IT team is restoring servers, how does the business continue to operate? Do we move employees to a secondary site? Do we have manual workarounds for critical processes? Do we have alternative suppliers? Business continuity is focused on the organization's ability to deliver products and services. It answers the question, how do we keep the business alive while we fix the technology? Here's a way to think about it. Imagine a hospital. A disaster strikes and the electronic medical record system goes down. Disaster recovery is what the IT team does to restore the system. Business continuity is what the hospital does to continue treating patients while the system is down, using paper records, manually verifying medications, prioritizing emergency cases. Both are essential, but they serve different purposes. Now, let's talk about how we plan for this. The foundation of BCDR is the Business Impact Analysis, or BIA. The BIA identifies which business functions are most critical and what the impact would be if they were disrupted. It helps you prioritize. Not every system needs to be restored in the first hour. The payroll system is critical. The employee cafeteria ordering system probably isn't. The BIA tells you what to focus on. The BIA also establishes two key metrics. The recovery time objective, or RTO, is how quickly a system or process must be restored after a disruption. If the RTO for your e-commerce platform is 4 hours, that means you need to have it back online within 4 hours. The recovery point objective, or RPO, is how much data loss is acceptable. If the RPO is 1 hour, that means you can afford to lose up to 1 hour of data, so you need to back up at least every hour. Here's an exam question you might see. A company's primary data center is destroyed by a fire. The IT team begins restoring systems from backups. What is the first priority? The answer is not the CEO's email or the development server. It's restoring the systems that support the organization's critical business processes as identified in the business impact analysis. You restore the most critical functions first. Another question. A company determines that after a disaster, they must have their order processing system operational within 2 hours to avoid significant revenue loss. What metric does this represent? The recovery time objective, or RTO. It's about time to restoration. A tip for you, when you're studying BCDR, always think about prioritization. The exam will present scenarios with multiple systems and limited resources. You need to know which one comes first based on business impact. And here's a pitfall: don't assume that disaster recovery is only about IT. The exam includes physical disasters, natural disasters, and other non-technical disruptions. Your planning must account for all of them. So now let's bring everything together. We've covered a lot of ground, and I want you to see how all these pieces fit into one cohesive ecosystem. This is the mental model you should carry with you throughout your CISSP journey and throughout your career. It starts with assets. You cannot protect what you don't know you have. So the first step is identifying your assets, your data, your systems, your people, your intellectual property, and understanding their value. What is the business impact if this asset is compromised? What is the cost of losing it? What is the cost of replacing it? This is your starting point. From asset valuation comes risk. You assess the threats that could harm your assets, the vulnerabilities that could be exploited, and the likelihood of those threats materializing. This is risk assessment. And risk assessment is not a one-time activity. It's ongoing. Threats change. Vulnerabilities appear. Your risk profile evolves. With that understanding of risk, you build governance and policies. Governance is the framework of rules, practices, and processes that guide how security is managed. Policies are the specific statements of intent that operationalize that governance. This is where you set expectations, define roles and responsibilities, and establish the boundaries within which everyone will operate. Then you enforce those rules. You implement controls based on the CIA Triad: confidentiality, integrity, availability. You manage access using the IAAA pipeline: identification, authentication, authorization, accountability. You apply technical controls like encryption and firewalls. You implement administrative controls like training and background checks. You put physical controls in place like locks and guards. All of these are the mechanisms that turn policy into reality. And finally, you plan for the inevitable. No matter how good your controls are, something will eventually fail. A hacker will find a way through. A system will crash. A natural disaster will strike. That's why you have business continuity and disaster recovery. BCDR is your safety net. It ensures that when the worst happens, the organization doesn't just survive, it continues to move forward. This is the complete security ecosystem. It's not a collection of disconnected activities. It's a continuous cycle. You assess assets to understand risk. You build governance to manage that risk. You enforce controls to mitigate that risk. And you prepare for failure so that the organization can recover and continue. Let me give you a real-world example. A financial services company has customer account data. That's the asset. They assess the risk and determine that a data breach could cost them millions in fines and reputational damage. So they build a governance framework with policies around data protection. They enforce that with encryption and strict access controls. And they implement disaster recovery plans so that if a ransomware attack encrypts their systems, they can restore from backups within hours and continue serving customers. Here's the kind of question you might see on the exam. An organization has completed a risk assessment and identified several high-priority vulnerabilities. What is the next step in the security ecosystem? The answer is to develop or update policies and controls to address those risks. Risk assessment informs governance and controls. It's all connected. A tip for you as you continue your studies: always keep this ecosystem in mind. When you encounter a question about a specific control or a particular risk, step back and ask yourself where it fits in the bigger picture. Understanding the flow from business context to security implementation is what separates a technical professional from a security architect. And here's my final piece of advice. As you prepare for this exam, don't just memorize terms. Understand how they connect. Understand the why behind the what. The CISSP is not a test of memorization, it's a test of judgment. And judgment comes from understanding the ecosystem we've just walked through. You've done great work today. Keep building on this foundation. Keep asking questions. Keep connecting the dots. I'm confident that if you approach this material with the right mindset, you will succeed. Good luck with your studies.